Uki, Nitaniku Enkki. Hello, my name in Blackfoot actually means singer, and my Christian name is Grant Manyheads, and I'm one of the interpreters here at Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. And today we're going to be talking about Firewater, or Napiochki. Basically, that translates to white man's water, and its history with the Blackfoot people are the Siksikaitsitapiiks. Now, for those of you who are just kind of tuning in, let me explain to you who the Siksikaitsitapiiks are. And if you look at this image, you could see this is the four existing tribes, and Siksikaitsitapiiks actually means Blackfoot-speaking people. And so these four tribes that exist are what's left of the Blackfoot speaking peoples here on the continent. So I'm actually from one of them, and that's the Siksikaat tribe. And then the other one is Agena, and then we have Piikani. And actually Piikani is split into two different groups. The one group is Apatusi Piikani, and these are the Piikani that live in Canada, up in the northern parts. And then the Amskapi Piikani, and these are the ones that live in the United States of America. And those Piikani they call Blackfeet in the United States of America. But they're basically the same tribe. They just split back in the late 1800s. So these four tribes make up the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. And this history lesson is about alcohol, firewater, liquor, and its effects on these four tribes. So actually, let's take a look at the next image. Now, Niitawasi is a Blackfoot word for it means our land. So when you look at this map here, this is what the Blackfoot considered their territory or their homeland. In history, the Blackfoot didn't just exist in this area. In fact, there were a lot of Blackfoot who lived on the western side of the mountains in places such as Windermere and the Tobacco Plains, and in Missoula, the Bitterroot Valley. So the Blackfoot weren't just a prairie people. They were also people who lived in the mountains, and our people knew the mountains. In fact, there was a lot of mountains that had Blackfoot names. So this was all part of Niitawasi, our land. And the thing is, our land was pretty much defined by the buffalo. Now there's a word that means Niitawasinani, and that basically translates to we are the people of the land of the buffalo. So wherever the buffalo roamed, the Blackfoot followed. And if you look at this particular image again, and you look at that yellow part, well, this is all prairie land. When you go north of the North Saskatchewan River, then you kind of enter into Aspen parkland. And there's a lot of trees and a lot of bush up in that area. And then below is the Yellowstone River. And when you kind of go past there, you're going into different land altogether. But between the Yellowstone River and the North Saskatchewan River, this is all prairie land. And in fact, we're kind of part of that Missouri Coteau, they call it, highland. And so the Blackfoot people, this was our hunting grounds. And as I mentioned, wherever the buffalo roamed, we followed. So our ancient stories, our origin stories tell us that this is our land, because there was many stories in different parts. In the Qu'Appelle Valley, the Touchwood Hills, we have Blackfoot stories of our people living in these areas. And then in the Yellowstone, we have a lot of sacred sites along the foothills of the mountains. Up in the northern parts, the North Saskatchewan, we have a lot of stories there as well, sacred stories that apply to the Blackfoot. To the Blackfoot, this proves that our people have lived in this area. You know, and unlike a lot of other Plains tribes, the Blackfoot have no migration stories. We've always felt that since after the flood, our people have always been here, and that we've never really moved. We've always been in this particular area. So just as a recap, the Blackfoot lands were from the Yellowstone River in the southern parts all the way up to the North Saskatchewan River, and from the Rocky Mountains pretty much out to the Qu'Appelle Valley and Touchwood Hills in those regions. And at that time we only had two allies, the Sarsi, or the Tsuut'ina as they prefer to be called, who came from the north and were kind of our northwestern ally. We were at peace with them. And then the Grovans, who were just kind of northeast of us, up near present-day Prince Albert, between the two Saskatchewan rivers. Well, they kind of lived there and in the Touchwood and Qu'Appelle Valley, but altogether we were at peace, and we traveled freely throughout the Blackfoot domains, throughout Niitawasi. So let's take a look at the next image. Here we can see the territory of the Blackfoot people. And I really don't like to say territory. This was our homeland, as I mentioned. And so if you look at this particular image, this is another map. You can see the Blackfoot, how far they went out to the east in those regions I mentioned, the Touchwood Hills and the Qu'Appelle Valley. And then to down south where Fort Union was, that's where the Missouri and the Yellowstone kind of meet, while even as far east as there. So this was our special territory, and the Blackfoot, as I mentioned, we lived along the backbone of the world. Now this was the name we had for the Rocky Mountains, our Mistakists. And these Rocky Mountains we considered the backbone of the world. And in fact, there was what they call the Old North Trail, which is a road that goes from the Yukon all the way down into present-day Mexico, a uniform distance of about 100 miles from the Rocky Mountains east. Well, this road existed, and this road went along the eastern slope of the mountains. And this is how the Blackfoot got to know our lands, was because we knew every source of water that came out of the Rocky Mountains flowing eastward. So as I mentioned, farthest east we went was like the Touchwood Hills and the Qu'Appelle Valley, which is kind of on the lower step. I mean, the Missouri Coteau is kind of where we are. Then the lower one kind of goes to the Manitoba Escarpment, and then you're getting in a Canadian Shield area, and a totally different way of living for those natives who lived in that area. But up top here was all buffalo, and this is where the Ini, as we say in Blackfoot, traveled. And wherever the Ini roamed, the Blackfoot followed. So let's take a look at the next image. Well, here's another picture of Niitawasi. So as I mentioned, wherever the great northern herds roamed, our people followed them. So our territory was defined by Ini. So we were true Plains Indians, and we were true buffalo hunters. That buffalo was our mainstay. That was our staff of life. So the Siksikaitsitapiiks were at first a people without horses. We traveled on foot. And wherever we went, following the buffalo, we did it on foot. Now, this is long before horses. So at that time, the only beast of burden that we had was our dogs, our imita, as we say in Blackfoot. And we would put these sleds, we put these poles in the back of our dogs, and the French used the word travois. While these dogs, and each family would have as many as 10 or 12 dogs, all kind of tethered on a leash, and they'd all have a travois on the back, and they would carry our loads from one place to the other. Now in those days, because you were on foot, the farthest you'd probably travel when you broke camp to set up another camp would be about 5 miles tops. And you're only as fast as the slowest member of your group. So if there was infirm, or if there was elderly or little children, perhaps that could hinder your progress or your distance. So maybe sometimes between 3 to 5 miles a day is as far as they would travel in the dog days. And in our language we say itotasi mapi imitakes, or the time when we use dogs to carry our loads, our burden. So this was the dog days. In those days, we were basically wandering pedestrians. And as I mentioned, it was in the dog days when we were on foot that we followed the buffalo all over that vast territory that you had seen on those maps. So our people got to know our land intimately. We knew every source of water, and we also knew the best places to hunt ini, our buffalo, and where the best kill sites were. And we followed the migration of the buffalo when they moved on the plains. And we realized that the buffalo didn't go south in the winter like a lot of animals. What they did was they went out into the open prairie in the eastern parts, and then in the winter, or when weather got bad, they came to the foothills, or they sheltered themselves in the river valleys, the wooded river valleys. So these are the places where the Blackfoot set up their winter camps in anticipation of the buffalo's return to these certain areas. So if we look at the next image, well, as it points out there, the dog days, the Siksikaitsitapiiks, they traveled only short distances at a time, and they were satisfied so long as they were within sight of the great herds of Iniksi. So as long as they saw buffalo, they were happy, because they know that they could hunt them, and that they can get their shelter, their furs, clothing, and their food. As I mentioned, the buffalo was the staff of life for the Blackfoot people. And unlike other plains tribes that hunted Ini or the buffalo, the Blackfoot hunted them year round. We followed them year round. A lot of these other tribes had sort of like homelands, and then they would come out and hunt the buffalo on the season, which was different. And then they would go back to their homeland or their area. To the Blackfoot, that big vast area that you saw earlier on the map, this was our homeland, and all year round we followed the buffalo herds. So if we look at the next image, we see here a herd of buffalo, and Ini, or Iniksi, they were our staff of life, as I mentioned, because it provided the Siksikaitsitapiiks with food, clothing, shelter, and it also had hundreds of other uses to the Blackfoot people. We would make tools, we could make different artifacts, different things we can make from the buffalo, from its hide, its sinew, from its fur, pillows, all sorts of different things. So this animal was just all we needed as people. And as long as we followed it and this animal was within sight of us, we were happy. So wherever Ini roamed, we followed. So let's take a look at the next image. As I mentioned, winter camps. So in the winter, the Blackfoot people, the Siksikaitsitapiiks, moved to the foothills or along the banks of the sheltered river valleys that were within our territory or within our homeland. And it's there that we set up our winter camps, because we knew that the Ini, or the buffalo, would leave the open prairie, as I mentioned, and they would come back to the foothills, to the sheltered river valleys to ride out the winter. And so in anticipation of that, we set up our winter camps. And then from there, then we would know that there's a buffalo nearby. And during the winter, if our parfleche bags full of pemmican or dry meat were to run out, or even not run out, but if there was fresh game that we could hunt that was nearby, then we would do so, just to make sure we had that food supply for the winter. Because in the Blackfoot country, Siksikaitsitapiiks, basically there was 6 months of winter. So half the year was winter and the other half of the year was spring. And the thing is, we had to be able to ride out those winter months because game was scarce, even in the winter. So if we look at the next image, there was some big changes, a fundamental change in this routine of ours. Like for literally, you have to remember that the Blackfoot, for thousands and thousands of years, since the time that we first came into being up until just a few centuries ago, we lived as pedestrians, walking all over our lands, and as I mentioned, using the dog as our beast of burden. And then all of a sudden, around the 1700s, this animal showed up, and we had no idea what to call this animal at the time. And so he was as big as an elk, but he was as helpful as a dog. So we put the two words together. In elk, we say bonoka. In Blackfoot, we call the dog imita. So together we put this word bonokomita, and in Blackfoot, I guess that would translate to elk dog. And this is the name that we call horses today, bonokomita. So once these bonokomita showed up around the 1700s, that changed our lives as Blackfoot people on an incredible scale, because now this animal could take us vaster distances, it could carry heavier weights, and also we could use this as warfare. So it kind of became a measure of wealth to own horses. We would actually raid other tribes for their horses, particularly the tribes that were west and south of us, because they had a lot of horses. And so when they would set up their camps and their winter camps, the Blackfoot, usually in bad weather, would go out to that country to steal as many horses as they possibly can, because, as I mentioned, this became a measure of wealth. So this animal changed our life on an incredible scale. And that started happening around the circa 1700s. It could have happened a few years before 1700 or a few years after, but we know it was around this time that the Blackfoot acquired bonokomita, the horse. So we look at the next image. You can kind of see there how the horses were dispersed. If you look on the western side of the continent, you can see the horses going up into Shawnee country and then eventually into the Blackfoot country and kind of crossing the mountains onto the plains there. And it was around 1700 or the late 1600s that the Blackfoot actually acquired the horse. So these horses were actually descendants of the animals brought by the Spanish, the conquistadors, and the ones that invaded Mexico and took it over in the 1500s. Well, over those years, these horses were acquired by southern tribes, and gradually they migrated north. Sometimes they were traded, and A lot of times they were stolen. So this was kind of the route of the horses coming up into the Blackfoot country, if you take a look at the map there, particularly on the western side of the map. So if we look at the next image, so right on the hard on the heels of the new horse culture came the Napequans, the Europeans with their wondrous goods. Now, just as a note, we didn't meet the Europeans right away, but we got their goods before we ever met a quote-unquote white man. Now, a lot of these goods came to us through Cree middlemen and Cineboi middlemen in trade. So even though we hadn't seen a European trader yet, a lot of these middlemen in trade would bring these artifacts, or not artifacts, these goods, I should say, and these wares out to the Blackfoot people on the plains. And the thing is, they had traders off the north, from the Northwest Company who came all the way from Montreal and the Great Lakes. And this is the route that they came to come out into Blackfoot country. But then you also had the Hudson Bay Company, and those traders came through the North Saskatchewan, and they were based on a York factory right on the Hudson's Bay. And these Cineboi and Cree middlemen would get these goods from them, and then they would bring them all the way out to Blackfoot country to trade for a lot of furs, usually 3 times what they were worth, the amount of furs the Blackfoot would give to these middlemen, just to receive kettles and pots and different clothing, different goods. But there were some goods that we never got just quite yet, and that was firearms and alcohol. These were goods that the Blackfoot were not familiar with at this point. But like I mentioned, hard on the heels of the new horse was changed our life. These new goods came, and a lot of these goods, such as knives and axes and kettles, they made daily life so much more easier for the Blackfoot speaking people, because now we could use these to cut down trees a lot easier, to do a lot of things that were a little bit harder to do. As an example, in the old days, the buffalo days, when we were pedestrians, before we ever had any trade goods, when we boiled our meat, we had to dig a pit in the ground, and we had to put a hide in there and drop hot rocks into it. And this whole process basically started when you started the fire at sunup until about midday, maybe about noon. And then after 5 or 6 hours, when the rocks were heated, then you could actually start your boiling pit and start boiling meat. Well, that was an all-day process. So you could see how much easier it was once you got a kettle or you got a pot, and you could just put that pot, fill it with water, and put it right on your fire, and you'd have boiling water within minutes. And you could do the same thing. You can cook your meat, you can cook whatever it is that you're going to boil. But that's what the trade goods did for the Blackfoot. They made life easier for us. So that's why they were so attractive. So as I mentioned, this Cree Cineboi middleman trade, this happened about 1680, like from the time when the Hudson Bay Company set up shop at York Factory on the Hudson Bay. So from that time, for almost 100 years, the Blackfoot were trading with the Cree and the Cineboi, and not the Europeans. So these Cree and Cineboi middlemen, they were sort of friendly to us, even though there was the odd conflicts, but they would come out into the Blackfoot lands, and then the Blackfoot would trade with them. So as I mentioned, these goods came to us first through the Cree and Cineboi middlemen, and these were from the Hudson Bay, as I mentioned, and from the Northwest Company, who were Frenchmen from Montreal. And so these two competing companies were actually bringing trade goods into the area, and the Cree and the Assiniboine controlled that trade with other tribes, because they wouldn't allow a lot of other tribes to go to the source of the trade goods. They would get the trade goods, and they would actually go to the different tribes and trade. So they made huge profits being the middlemen in this sort of a trade. And you know what's funny is, more often than not, these the prairie tribes paid, as I mentioned, 3 times more for goods. And the thing is, these goods weren't brand new, of course not. These were used goods. The Cree and the Assiniboine would have pots or kettles or things that they were using, and then after 2 or 3 years of use by them, then they would trade these items to the other tribes, who would eagerly take them in and pay that amount, the 3 times. And then these Cineboi Cree middlemen would go back to York Factory or wherever they would go, and then they would trade these furs for brand new items. So this was pretty much the type of trade that was happening. So a lot of the goods that the Blackfoot were getting were secondhand goods during this time period. And as I mentioned, during this time period, alcohol, liquor was not part of the trade, as far as we know. And also, there was no firearms. And if there was, it was limited, very limited, because the Cree and Assiniboine simply didn't want these other tribes to become powerful enough to to hurt them. So they controlled that trade. So if we look at the next image, we see Manchester House. Now this is a Hudson Bay Company post. Now if you ever read or you look up Canadian history, especially with the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, well, these are two rival fur trade outfits that were competing with one another. And so they came up the North Saskatchewan eventually. So in 1786, Hudson Bay Company, this was maybe 3 of their posts already built west, inland from York Factory. And for the most part, the Hudson Bay Company stayed in the York Factory, and then they allowed the Creo, the Cineboi, and the Middlemen in this trade to bring in trade items, to bring in the pelts that they desired. And then they would give them the goods. Well, after a while, the Creo and the Cineboi and kind of depleted the hunting, the beaver and those small fur-bearing mammals in that area that they lived in. So they had to go westward, go up the Saskatchewan River to get more beaver pelts, more small fur-bearing mammals, where there was abundance of them near the Rocky Mountains. And whereas farther out towards the Canadian Shield or York Factory, a lot of these animals were almost being extirpated from those areas. There wasn't as many. And so the Hudson Bay Company had to build posts. And when they built a post, usually their rivals built a fort not too far from them. They kind of worked together, but they were rivals. So the Northwest Company would set up posts pretty much right beside the Hudson Bay Company. And in this particular case, this was Manchester House. And this was the first place that the Blackfoot began to go to regularly without the middlemen in trade, and where we would trade directly with the European traders, especially the Hudson Bay Company, and then eventually the Northwest Company. In fact, I think it was the Northwest Company Traders, a French, that the Blackfoot met first, and then we met the Hudson Bay Company. So as we came to Manchester House, this is when we started to have a regular trade with the Europeans. So now we can get those items we couldn't get before, such as firearms and liquor. So if we look at the next image, here we see that Blackfoot Niitawasi, and we see the area there, and you can see up top there the different trading posts or forts that the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company set up all along the North Saskatchewan River, all the way westward to Fort Edmonton eventually, and then to Rocky Mountain House. And these were the Fort Edmonton and Rocky Mountain House were the 2 nearest to the Blackfoot country. And so this is where the Blackfoot, the Siksikaitsitapiiks, would go to trade their furs for trade goods. But all along those Hudson Bay Company posts and Northwest Company posts within our territory, our Blackfoot people would trade with them. And in fact, the Siksika, my tribe, our people were farther east, and so we would be up near those different ones that are in the eastern parts, northeastern parts of our lands, like from Buckingham House, Fort George, Manchester House, Fort Carleton, and all of these different places. And then the Bloods, or Agena, they would pretty much trade in some of those same areas as well. And then with the Mckenzie, they would trade up near the mountains, closer to the mountains, like Rocky Mountain House and Fort Edmonton, and these different trading posts. So this is basically how the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company set up their forts all along the North Saskatchewan, and this is where the Blackfoot traded with them. But the thing is, they weren't on Blackfoot land. They're actually on the north side of the river. And so, as I mentioned, on the north side of the North Saskatchewan, you come into bushland and you come into a lot of trees. And so there's not as much buffalo in those areas. There were some buffalo, wood buffalo, but they didn't travel around in the huge, huge herds as they did in the prairies south of these different forts. So if we look at the next image, the fur trade. Well, when the first Napequans began trading with the Siksikaitsitapiiks, this was on a regular basis in the late 1700s. So as I mentioned, at that time, their respective companies, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they're already engaged in a bitter struggle for supremacy in the fur trade. Like, they were already actually warring in different places. There was a lot of violence in some different parts when they tried to get the upper hand. But as time went on, they basically had a sort of friendly rivalry. But it wasn't always the case. But during this time, they were competing already, and when they started to meet the Blackfoot tribes, they wanted the Blackfoot business, so they each tried to figure out ways to entice the Blackfoot to trade with them, because they knew that the Blackfoot trade was huge, huge. There was literally at that time tens of thousands of Siksikaitsitapiiks. And each of them all had different furs that they would bring to the company. So they were making huge profits every time they got the Blackfoot speaking peoples to come to their different forts. So if we look at the next image, here we see the coat of arms for each of these companies. The Hudson Bay Company was actually established in England in 1670. And 10 years they already had York factory on the Hudson Bay. And they were competing with the Montreal-based company, the Northwest Company. And these are just a bunch of peddlers or sellers, people who were fur traders who kind of gathered together and started to do this fur trade. But during this time, they proved to be more than a match for the Hudson Bay Company, because the French would use whiskey, they would use liquor in their trade, and this enticed a lot of different tribes to trade with them. Not just the Blackfoot, but even before they came to the Blackfoot, they were already doing this with a lot of tribes east of us, especially up along the Great Lakes area and the Mississippi Basin, and then the St. Lawrence and areas east of there. They're already using liquor to entice the different native tribes there to come to trade with them. They weren't selling it, they were giving it as gifts. And so soon after, the Hudson Bay Company had to do so as well. So we look at the next image, and here's the beaver. Now this little animal here, this was the most vied animal, his fur, how do you say it, his pelt, and other animals, small animals, their furs were very valuable. And this was because of the fashion industry in Europe. So the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company were competing to see who would get the most beaver pelts and other small furs for fashion-conscious Europe. So this went to, this animal was almost extirpated because of the fashion industry in Europe. So this is the importance of the beaver, a lot of hats and such. And this just distinguished people in Europe. If you had these sort of hats, then people would know basically what class of people you came from, if whether you're rich or poor or middle class or whatever. But it was because of this. And the beaver was used because it was durable, it was waterproof, and you could make a lot of different items with it. So as I mentioned, it was a symbol of social superiority if you owned any of these types of hats. And so a lot of the military and a lot of rich people would have these types of fashion just to distinguish themselves from the poorer classes. And this was all in Europe. So if we look at the next image, here we have the Northwest Company. And David Thompson was actually worked for both companies. He worked for the Hudson Bay Company, and then he went off on his own with the Northwest Company for a while, and he ended up going back to the Hudson Bay Company. But David Thompson actually came and met the Blackfoot around 1787. And so in 1787, he spent the winter with the Mckenzie. And it was at that time that he established friendly trading relations with them. And so at that time, this is when the Blackfoot began to trust a lot of these Napequans and knew that whenever they were in the Blackfoot area, that they were coming with trade goods. And so they were welcomed. For the most part, there wasn't much bloodshed or war between the Blackfoot and the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. So we look at the next image. Here we see the Northwest Company. This is the trade route. As I mentioned, they were based out of Montreal, so you can kind of see them coming all this way through the top part of the Great Lakes. And this is just in the Canadian or in the British domains. They're actually down below the Great Lakes too, the French, and they're in the Mississippi region all the way down to St. Louis, all the way down to, oh, what is that city again? I'm sorry. I kind of forgot that. Got hit by a hurricane not too long ago. Anyways, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, the French were trading. But here up in the British possessions, you could see the route they took to get out to Blackfoot country. So you can see them going from the Great Lakes and present-day Ontario, and then they're making their way through Manitoba to Saskatchewan, and then eventually they're making their way on the North Saskatchewan all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And this is where they start to trade with the Blackfoot tribes. So this was the Northwest Company Trade Route around circa 1820. And over here we see the Hudson Bay Company. They weren't traveling as far across the continent. They're up there in the Hudson Bay at York factory, and they kind of made their way south to the North Saskatchewan River, and then they made their way to the Rocky Mountains. And along the way, they basically started trading with the Blackfoot on a regular basis. And we were kind of, how would you say, their mainstay. They needed our trade. That was a lot of furs, a lot of profits to be made from the trading with the Blackfoot. So over here we have Fort Edmonton, as we mentioned earlier, and Fort Edmonton was a Hudson Bay Company post, and it was established in 1794. And as I mentioned, not too long after this, and then the Northwest Company set up a trading post not too far from the Fort Edmonton. But Fort Edmonton is kind of basically where present-day Edmonton, the city of Edmonton, Alberta is. And this picture here, where this particular fort was established, would be the legislative grounds now in the city of Edmonton. Well, on this is one of the two trading posts that the Blackfoot frequented. So we would come here regularly to trade our goods, our furs for goods. So if we look at the next image, we see Rocky Mountain House. Well, this was the farthest post west that the Hudson Bay Company set up a trading post. And this was the closest to the Blackfoot country, Blackfoot domain, Niitawasi. So most of the tribes came to this area to trade their furs for trade goods. So this was established around 1799. And so our people were trading with the Europeans regularly by this time. No middlemen in trade. In fact, what ended up happening with the middlemen is they started to compete with us for these same trade goods, because now they were no longer, they didn't have that benefit of being middlemen in trade. Now they were competing with the Blackfoot tribes, and a lot of that ended up in warfare and bloodshed. Unfortunately, that's how it kind of panned out historically. So if we look at the next image, here we see the Blackfoot Niitawasi again, and the trading posts all up in the northern part there. So these fur trade posts, we benefited from trading with these people because, as I mentioned, things became easier for us when we had these trade goods. Like if you ever worked in hides, it's a long process. You have to use it all and punch holes in different parts of two different hides if you wanted to sew them or bind them together. And required a lot of strength, a lot of time to work the hides, to make the clothing or to make the item that you're making out of hide. But now all of a sudden you could go to the trading post and just grab a blanket or grab some material, and you could buy scissors, and you could buy needle and thread, thimbles, and you can cut this material so easy. Then you could sew it together to make jackets and to make clothing or to make whatever it is that you wanted to make. So the trade goods that were offered, they helped us. They made life a lot easier for the Blackfoot speaking peoples. And the thing is, these trading posts were just beyond our hunting ground. So these people weren't interfering with us as our day-to-day routine, our life, our customs. We were able to travel still within our lands freely. And we didn't have a bunch of European people coming onto our lands and setting up shop and taking over. That happened way, way later. But up until this time, the Europeans stayed at their forts and they didn't interfere with our day-to-day lives. So the traders had little effect on our customs and our daily life. And so this meant that we were able to retain control over our lands. And so because of that, we were independent, maintain our independence. And so this is the way it was in those days. In the pre-European era, we were still able to carry on as we always did. So if we look at the next image, as I mentioned, well, when we started dealing regularly with the different trading posts and they were near our land, well then the Siksikaitsitapiiks acquired a regular supply of guns and ammo. And at this time these were muskets, single shot muskets, and we got the powder and the powder flasks and the powder horns and all of these different things from the trading posts. Because once the middlemen were eliminated as the middlemen, and once the traders reached Blackfoot territory and established posts, we no longer needed to rely on the middlemen. And the thing is, they had no power over us anymore, because now we were equal to them. We had the same guns and ammunition. And in fact, at that time, we were the only tribe, basically in Canada, that had two things. We had horses in abundance from our raids and from trading and bringing them up into our land. And we also had guns. So now by this time, the Blackfoot speaking peoples were equestrian and we had firearms. So we were able to expand our raids and our territory into other areas, because we had the numbers, We had the guns and the horses. So we were pretty powerful in those days. So we look at the next image. Well, here's the Hudson Bay Company. And so the Hudson Bay Company Trade from 1670 to 1770. So that first century when the Hudson Bay Company had no competition, the HBC didn't deal in liquor. They didn't sell it. They didn't even offer it as gifts. As it's mentioned here, the Hudson Bay Company imported just enough wine, brandy, and rum to serve the needs of its own officers and men. So in 1770, for example, they only brought in 250 gallons of liquor for the entire Hudson Bay Company at the York factory. So the only people at that time who were drinking alcohol, drinking liquor, were the Hudson Bay Company. Soldiers, officers, workers, traders, they're men. They're the only people who were drinking. And they only brought in enough liquor from England or wherever they were bringing their liquor in to serve the needs of their own company. So for basically 100 years, they did not use liquor in the trade with the native peoples. That's an interesting note, because the thing is, they could have continued that way, but that just wasn't the case. Things changed. So if we look at the next image, well, now they had to compete with the Northwest Company. Now these were Quebec Traders. They were from Montreal, as I mentioned, and they were called Nor'westers. And so these people were descendants of the French voyageurs and the Coureurs de Bois in the eastern parts of Canada and the United States. And so, as I might have mentioned earlier, these people were already using liquor as a way to entice tribes to trade, especially around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence and places like this. And so when they came up into the western parts of present-day Canada, mainly Ontario, Manitoba, and then when they started competing with the Hudson Bay Company for the Blackfoot trade, they brought their liquor as well, and they continued using those same methods when they met these other tribes. So the Blackfoot kind of got their first taste of liquor, I imagine, from the Northwest Company. So if we look at the next image, well, as I mentioned, when the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company first met head-to-head in the west on the prairies, the Nor'westers, they dominated the trade. And that's because of their excessive distribution of alcohol. And mostly as gifts. These were gifts to entice the natives to their forts. And then later as items of trade. But at first, what they would do is they would go to these tribes and they would give them liquor, watered down somewhat, but they would get them drunk and get the natives drunk and then having a good time with the liquor. And so they would invite them into the different trading posts and give them liquor and then give them enough to take back to their camp so that they could have a good bender, basically. And then when they were sober, these natives would come back to that fort and they would trade their trade items or pelts for different goods. And so there was sort of a friendly thing at that time. And this is how they would entice the tribes to come trade with them. So if we look at the next image, well, the Hudson Bay Company was convinced that if they wanted to survive in competition with the Northwest Company, they had to do the same thing. So by this time, 1785, they were bringing in more than 2,000 gallons a year to its depot at York. And by the time that they started established trade with the Blackfoot or the Siksikaitsitapiiks, well, they increased that to almost 8,000 gallons annually. And it wasn't just 8,000 gallons that they shipped in. They had their own still in the York factory, so they made their own liquor as well. They supplemented the liquor products of the company's own still at York factory. So if you really think about it, in those years that the Hudson Bay Company wasn't using liquor in the trade, they were only bringing in 250 gallons a year. That's 250, enough to serve the needs of its own men and its officers and people. But that changed when the Northwest Company came in competition. From 2,000 gallons a year they were shipping into York factory, and then because of the Blackfoot trade, they made that 8,000 gallons. So this is how much they were shipping in, from 250 gallons a year to 8,000 gallons of alcohol, liquor, every year to York factory. And this was brought up by canoes and to the trading posts in large kegs, and this is what they would start to use to entice the Blackfoot tribes into trade. So let's take a look at the next. So here we kind of see what they call Rupert's Land, and this is all the rivers that drain into Hudson Bay. So when Henry Hudson came into this area, basically this was what they considered British territory, our Hudson Bay Company, really, territory, because they felt that they bought and paid for anything that came out of these lands. So anything that was along the rivers, beaver, small fur-bearing mammals, they believed that this was their domain. This is where they could trade. So this is, and the Blackfoot Nitawasi kind of fell within this area here. So they felt that they had the right to come up into the Blackfoot territories or to the Nitawasi to trade and trade with the natives there, because we were sort of not theirs, but kind of delegated, or they were allowed the right to trade with these native tribes. So if we look at the next image, they shipped from overseas in big kegs such as this, high wines they called them. So both companies, they handled primarily rum and brandy, and and these were called high wines, and these were brought by water routes from either England or Montreal, and they were carried in concentrated form in these large wooden kegs. So this is how the alcohol got to Blackfoot country. Usually it got to York factory, and then they shipped it up in smaller vessels, smaller kegs. But if we take a look at the next image, here we see some of those smaller kegs. They have to be able to fit into a canoe, because at that time, that's all they could do. They could only bring the trade goods from York factory through the canoe system on the North Saskatchewan. So a canoe could probably carry up to 1,000 pounds. And so they had limited amounts of alcohol that they could bring up. So they would have to bring them up in smaller kegs. And so once they arrived at their destinations, these spirits, or this alcohol, was diluted with water on the ratio of 7-to-1 for the Blackfoot. So when the natives came to trade, they took away the liquor either in skin bags, as you see on the side there, or in small kegs provided by the companies. And this is how the natives would get the liquor. And as I mentioned, usually this was as gifts at first, and eventually these became items of trade. So if we take a look at the next image, we'll just talk a little bit about liquor. So like in the Blackfoot language, we call it napiuchki, which basically translates to white man's water. And so prior to contact with the Europeans, napiuchki, our alcohol, our liquor, had been virtually unknown to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, just like it was virtually unknown to most of the North American tribes until the Europeans arrived, while the Siksika were no different. So for thousands of years, we lived without alcohol. We didn't use it for anything. So when we first got it, it altered our lives, because we really didn't know why we maybe hallucinated or saw things or felt so good after drinking a little bit of it. So it became a big thing. Figure a little bit of good feeling, we can make ourselves feel even better by drinking more and getting more alcohol. And so we really didn't know how to handle this. And because it was perceived to be a form of water, at that time the Blackfoot wouldn't even pay for it. So they had to give it as gifts, because the Blackfoot didn't see it as anything, as like some sort of water, magical water maybe. And that's why at first we refused to pay for it. So they gave it as gifts to entice us into trade. Yeah, so if we look here, alcoholism, at that time it wasn't even a concern amongst the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, because there simply were no alcoholics. We had no people at that time who were given to drinking or desired it or were addicted to it. But by this time, alcoholism did actually exist with other tribes to the east of us. So by the time that the trade began in the west, tribes along the eastern seaboard were already being dominated by this deadly brew. And so at that time, the Siksikaitsitapiiks were not immediately drawn to it, but it was already having an effect on a lot of the tribes that were east of us. And like the Creo and the Cineboi Middlemen, they were actually getting this too from the Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Companies, long before the Blackfoot ever received it. So if we look at the next image, as we mentioned here, Manchester House and the trade in 1787. This one trader there in 1787, he commented that the Picani, that they were quiet. When they came to trade, they were very quiet people, and they didn't have anything to fear from them or the Blood Indians, the Gaina. They came to get a few items, they got their alcohol, and then usually they left, and there was no violence and there was no problems at that time, 1787. And so the Canadians or the Northwest Company, the fear was to the Hudson Bay Company is that once the Northwest Company got amongst these natives, things would change. And that's basically kind of what happened. Their predictions were true, because once the Northwest Company started to trade with the native different tribes, particularly the Blackfoot, then social issues started to rise. There were a lot of problems that came from the excess alcohol that was being given out. So we look at the next image. You've got to remember that date. So 1787, the Blackfoot still didn't have a problem with alcohol. Now in 1789, there was a trader there. His name was Edward Umfraville. Well, he stated in 89 that these people are not so far enervated by the use of spirituous liquors as to be slaves to it. When they come to trade, they drink moderately, and they buy themselves necessaries for war and domestic conveniences. So even by 1789, at the beginning of the trade with the European traders and the Blackfoot-speaking tribes, the Blackfoot were going there mostly just for the trade goods. And they would maybe look at the alcohol or liquor as a novelty. Maybe there's a few people who would get drunk. But for the most part, this was not a big trade item or even a gift item. The people would go there to get their trade goods, but alcohol wasn't a problem. We weren't slaves to it, as he puts it. So we weren't wanting to go into their camps and say, "Where's your liquor? We want the liquor." It was just another trade item. It wasn't a big deal to the Blackfoot at this time, 1789. But that soon changed, because let's remember these dates. This is early in the Blackfoot history when it came to alcohol. 1787, we were still good behavior. 1789, 2 years later, we're still getting gifts of liquor, but we're still behaving as a people, as trading. So if we look at the next image, here we see gifts of alcohol. So as I mentioned, the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company knew that to gain and to maintain the Blackfoot trade, they had to make the Siksikaitsitapiiks dependent on alcohol and then supply it in greater quantities than their competition. So as a result, spirits were given as gifts by both companies liberally until their goal was achieved. So at this time, there was a lot of liquor that was being plied to the Blackfoot tribes. And they did it to other tribes, but we're speaking of the Siksikaitsitapiiks here. So the different tribes of Blackfoot that would go to these trading posts, because the Hudson Bay Company wanted their trade and the Northwest Company wanted their trade, they would entice them in with liquor. And then they would give them more and more and more of it. And then they would give them kegs to take back to their camps to drink. And so a lot of times the Blackfoot were drinking for 3 days, going on a 3-day bender before the alcohol was gone, before they sobered up. And then they came back to the forts to do serious trade. And then they would trade their items with the traders after a 3-day bender. So if we look at the next image, and this is all because of the gifts of alcohol. And so in 1794, a Northwest Company trader at Fort George on the North Saskatchewan, which wasn't too far from present-day Edmonton, city of Edmonton, they described how successful they had been. And they quote here, "The love of rum is the first inducement to industry," this trader wrote. And then he said, "They undergo every hardship and fatigue to procure a skinful of this delicious beverage." Well, that's his words, delicious. And then he further described how alcohol had become an integral part of the trading process. So now by this time, from 1787 to 1794, which wasn't even 7 years, because of the excess alcohol that the traders were giving to the Blackfoot, now the Blackfoot became dependent on it when it came to trading time. When they came to the trading posts, they wanted that liquor. They wanted to get drunk. They wanted that free liquor and do that 2 or 3 day bender thing. And then after they were done, then they would go do the serious trade. But this became normal. This became routine. This became the pattern of trade between the Blackfoot speaking tribes and with the Hudson Bay and Northwest Company traders. Alcohol became a big part of this trade, especially as it was still being given out as gifts. Now, if we look at the next image, here we see the Blackfoot domain once again with the trading post to the north of us there. And you can see the Hudson Bay Company and all these posts. And all of these different posts serve liquor. So when the Blackfoot would go to these places, we expected to get gifts of liquor from either the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company. And now here's the thing is if one of them was cheap, if the Hudson Bay Company they felt was not giving out as much liquor, they would go to the Northwest Company and they would get more. So liquor started to become sort of a problem by this time. So if we take a look at the next image. So here we have 1811. While in 1811, the trading procedure, the pattern, had become well established. In that year, trader Alexander Henry, he commented, "Spirituous liquor now seems to dominate them." And these were the Bigani. And he wrote, "and has taken such a hold upon them that they are no longer the quiet people they were. They appear fully as much addicted to liquor as the Crees." So by 1811, if you think of 1797, when everything was still good, or 1787, I should say, where things were still good, not even 20, 30, 34 years later, now the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, a lot of them were addicted to alcohol. They were addicted to coming to the forts. And by this time, they were selling it. It wasn't just an item of gift. Now they were selling items. So they would get them drunk. They would get gifts of liquor to entice them to trade. But now, once they left, the natives could buy kegs. They could buy kegs of alcohol, and they can keep their drunkenness long after the trade was done, maybe for a week or two, depending on how much liquor they got from these trading posts. So by this time, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of domestic violence. There were a lot of violence between friends and people within the tribe. People would die from a lot of these encounters going to the trading posts. So the thing is, if we look at the curious thing is in the winter count records of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, it's around this time, 1800s, that you get the odd entry there. You get the odd pictograph that kind of depicts violence. Maybe somebody was killed, a woman was killed, it would say. And a lot of these times, this was as a result of people being drunk. Even though the winter counts would not say the reason why someone may have died, it would have been around the time that they visited these trading posts. So we know that alcohol was already starting to have a bad effect on the Blackfoot-speaking peoples by this time. Now, if we take a look at the next image, so as I mentioned, the trading procedure by this time was already well established. So the thing is, the Blackfoot would come, and in fact, it was sort of the Napequans, the traders, who made a big issue out of the pipe ceremony. Now, amongst the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, whenever we met with other tribes, we would always smoke a pipe if we were at peace to have good intentions towards one another. And this pipe was because the smoke went heavenwards towards the heavens, as I mentioned, and basically these were carrying, we thought, our prayers to the Creator. So it was always with good intentions that we would meet with other people. While by this time, it was the traders who kind of got a grasp of this, and so whenever the tribes would visit, they would always have a huge pipe ceremony, elaborate, and this kind of served the needs of the native peoples because it made you feel good. You think that you're important, that they're doing this. But right soon after this, they would offer the gifts of alcohol, and then during this time, they would get the leaders who came into the post drunk, and then they would give them kegs, barrels of whiskey to take back to their camps. And then they would do the 3-day bender, as I mentioned. They would get nice, gloriously drunk for a few days. And then they would come back to the trading post to do the serious trade. And this became the pattern. This is how the Blackfoot would trade with these traders. As I mentioned, literally for about almost 100 years, 80 years, this became the pattern. So if we take a look at the next image, the same trading procedure would be there would be one of the trading people who would meet maybe a couple of natives from a certain tribe, and these natives would be the vanguard. They would come ahead and let the fort know that their chief, that their tribe was coming to trade, and then these people that came to the fort, they would get a gift of whiskey to bring back to, or not whiskey, but liquor, and then they would bring some of it back to the chiefs or back to their leaders. So after that, then the main body, like the rest of the tribe, would actually show up, and then they would trade. And so the chiefs were invited into the fort, and then they went through that pipe smoking ritual, as I mentioned, and then it was followed by the excess distribution of liquor. So this became a well-established pattern of trade between the Blackfoot-speaking peoples and the Hudson Bay and Northwest companies during that time. So if we look at the next image, as I mentioned, the pipe smoking ritual, and here the Alexander Henry, he speaks and he says, "After the first round, we gave them each half a gill of Indian liquor, beginning always with the principal chief, who is about as ceremonious in taking a drink as he is in smoking. He dips his finger into the liquor and lets a few drops fall to the ground. Then a few drops are offered above, but he drinks the rest without further delay." So this kind of became a ritual sort of created by the Napequans, the European traders, when the tribes came to visit. This wasn't something that the native peoples initiated. This was something that the traders initiated. So if we look at the next image, so as we're speaking about trading procedure, here we see the camp. Well, after smoking and drinking for about half an hour, each chief was given a quart of liquor to take back to the camp. And others who wanted liquor, they went to the fort to trade bits of meat, buffalo tongue, or other, as the writer writes, trash. And they just give them these gifts of alcohol so they could drink all day and into the evening. And as I mentioned, sometimes for days they would drink until they were nice and drunk. And then, if we look at the next image, then you see the natives going to the fort to trade. This is the serious trade. So the next morning, or at least when they were all sober after the next day of drinking, then they began to the serious trade. They continued to buy some liquor, but most of their furs and their robes and dried meat and horses, they were exchanged for metal objects, utensils, cloth, and other European goods. And this became routine. So if we look at the next image, so there was a time there when the liquor, this liquor traffic had continued unabated until the British territory, until 1821. So in 1821, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they merged. So basically, instead of competing and being rivals with one another, by 1821 they became one company, but they retained the name of Hudson Bay Company. And so at this time there was no competition. And so you'd think that they would have eliminated the whiskey or the liquor as enticements for trade. But actually this didn't happen. For about a good 10 years without competition, they still gave out limited amounts as gifts of alcohol, and they weren't really selling it to the Blackfoot and different native tribes. But then in 1831, the American Fur Company finally managed to make roads into Blackfoot country. Because from the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, 1805, when they killed 2 Blackfoot, well, then the Blackfoot looked at those tribes as enemies. No, sorry, not the tribes, but the white men from the south and from the east as enemies. So when those traders, trappers, or whatever, when those Napequans from the south and the east came into Blackfoot country, they were met with hostility. The Blackfoot simply did not want them in our land. So we killed them, and we killed a lot of these people went missing in Blackfoot country during this time period from about 1804 right up until about 1831, and mostly because of a man named Jacob Berger, who came into the Blackfoot country. He spoke Blackfoot, and he managed to get the Blackfoot to trust him. Then he was able to open trade with the Blackfoot for the American Fur Company. And so around 1831, the Americans became established among the Siksikaitsitapiiks on the upper Missouri. So it's this time the AFC built Fort Union, as you can see in the image there and in the background. And it's at this time that they started to trade regularly with the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, right at the eastern, basically almost the southeastern, or at least the eastern part of the Blackfoot, Nitawasi. So, and these people didn't hesitate to traffic in whiskey. A lot of them were former Northwest Company, former Hudson Bay Company traders, and so they started to traffic in whiskey because they knew that was how you could lure the Blackfoot tribes to the forts to trade. So we look at the next image. Here we see the Afc Trade Route. So even though whiskey was sold by the AFC, it wasn't its main stock in trade. It's like the Hudson Bay Company, the AFC gave it as a gift at first to bring in the customers, but they sold it in limited quantities. And here you can see their route along the river. And basically they were kind of based in St. Louis. So where the Mississippi and the Missouri meet, St. Louis is right there, and that was kind of the capital of the American Fur Company trade. So they would take boats and barges and they would move up the Missouri River, and then you see the forts that they set up all along the way. You can see Fort Union at the top there, and this is where the Blackfoot began to trade with the American Fur Company. And then they actually moved further westward, and eventually they built Fort Mckenzie, and then they built Fort Benton, which became the center of trade later in the future. But at this time, this is the trade route, and this is how the American Fur Company came up the Missouri. Now, over time, the American Fur Company started to use steamboats, so they're able to bring up more people, more trade goods, all the way up the Missouri, up to these different forts here. And then they were able to carry more goods, more buffalo robes, more small fur-bearing mammal robes, all sorts of different things they could bring downriver. So that's the advantage the American Fur Company had over the Hudson Bay Company, who were still using canoes on their water route on the North Saskatchewan. And like I mentioned with the canoes, you could only carry maybe 1,000 pounds. The steamboats could literally carry 20 times that amount. So if we look at the next image, so now the Hudson Bay Company and the American Fur Company became rivals. So given this new competition, the Hudson Bay Company felt it had no alternative but to continue to supply liquor. So by this time, they actually had banned it in a lot of other parts of Canada, trading with the native peoples. They wouldn't use the liquor, but because they desired the Blackfoot trade, and now they're in competition with the Americans far to the south, they wouldn't give up using liquor as a way to entice the tribes for trade. So they would still give it as gifts. They would still give them rum and brandy, and that was a big part of the British Blackfoot trade. And this wasn't discontinued until 1862, but up until that time, the Hudson Bay Company still used liquor to attract the Blackfoot tribes and other tribes to trade with them. So we look at the next image. Here we see Fort Benson on the Missouri. So as I mentioned, they put up Fort Union, but because they wanted to get closer to the Blackfoot and get more access to the buffalo robes and different furs that the Blackfoot were bringing in, they set up Fort Mckenzie, which lasted for a few years up until about 1846, and then it was burnt down by the Blackfoot because of tensions and because of bloodshed that happened between the Blackfoot and the traders at that particular fort. So it wasn't until maybe about the same year that they actually moved upriver, the American Fur Company, and then they established Fort Benton. First it was a stockade, but by 1850 they had already established this as a fort, a major trading post for the American Fur Company. And so in 1850, this is when they kind of first started. And so by this time, the Blackfoot people were still trading as they did for hundreds of years. It was a routine. They only visited these forts once or twice a year to bring in their robes for trade goods. And so this is how the Blackfoot trade was. So during that time, from about 1786 right up until about 1850, it wasn't the young people who got drunk off the liquor. It was the older people. It was the leaders. These are the ones who got used to drinking, and it was usually them that drank. And there's a lot of witnesses from the different forts who realized this. This was a trend. It wasn't something the young people simply didn't drink at this time. It wasn't a big deal for them. It was something that the grandfathers or the leaders or the older people did, but the warriors, the younger people, they didn't get used to drinking whiskey because it interfered with thinking and it interfered with hunting. And so by this time, this periodic drinking in the camps, when it resulted in violence and bloodshed, usually it was because of the leaders or the older people. It wasn't the younger people. So, but as I mentioned, there was violence and a lot of bloodshed that happened when the Blackfoot visited these forts, but it's mostly limited to the older people. A lot of the younger people did not partake of the alcohol that was being given out. So we look at the next image. So here what we talk about the effects of the liquor trade on the Siksikaitsitapiiks. Well, as I mentioned, once they visited once or twice a year, it was disastrous. Like the effects of the liquor on the Blackfoot-speaking peoples while they were at the trading posts. When you look at the historical record, it's destruction to the Blackfoot-speaking people, especially at the trading posts and when they returned to camp. It was bad. There was a lot of violence and a lot of bloodshed that happened when they came to visit these trading posts. And so during the decades of excessive distribution by the fur traders, this liquor, it created havoc among the tribes of the people. And I guess the lucky thing is for the tribes was that they weren't buying it in huge quantities during this time. Usually the liquor that they received, most of it, if it was in big quantities, was gifts. So once the liquor was gone, then basically the party was over. There was nothing more. You're back to life. But during the time when the liquor was available, a lot of feuds erupted and disputes, a lot of them resulting in bloodshed and death. So this is how it was from about 1787 right up until 1950 when Fort Benton was established. And as I mentioned, the only reason it wasn't more serious was because we weren't buying the liquor so much, and we only visited the forts once or twice a year. So it wasn't a major disruption of the Blackfoot people's daily lives and customs. We still did the same things we did for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but it was only during those once or twice visits to the trading posts that things got out of hand and maybe some bad things happened. But after they left the trading post, it was back to life as normal, as we knew it. our daily routines. So if we look at the next image, we see that between 1670 and 1831, well, the liquor trade was a profitable business, and this is why the companies did it. At first, it was the Hudson Bay Company in rivalry with the Northwest Company, and they both used that rivalry as an excuse for using liquor to entice trade. And they did this because they were making huge profits from this. The fashion industry in Europe, the fur trade was making a lot of money, a lot of profits for both of these companies. And then when they merged, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, for 10 years there was no competition. And then all of a sudden in 1831, with the American Fur Company joining, becoming basically their next rival trade group, well, then the whiskey continued, and more of it, because American Fur Company were using more and more liquor to entice trade. So regardless of the consequences of what happened to these tribes, the violence and everything, the traders simply didn't care. And why should they? They were making huge profits, and usually the violence didn't affect them. It only affected the native peoples. And so they didn't worry about it too much. So this is what was happening up until 1831, and then right up until 1850 when Fort Benson was established. So if we look at the next image, we're pretty much at the end of our history lesson for today. Next week we're going to get back into part 2, and then we'll get into part 3, and when it actually came into Canada, or into the Blackfoot country, up in the Whoop-Up is what they called it. But if you want to learn a little bit more about the fur trade, and then how the Blackfoot traded with them and the different tribes of the Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Company, this is some good reading, and I would advise you to pick up this book if you get a chance, or to read it. It's written by Arthur J. Ray, and it's called Indians in the Fur Trade. And this is basically when the Hudson Bay Company, he writes about the Hudson Bay Company when they set up shop in the York factory, and then the rivalries that existed at that time when the Northwest Company moved out west, and then how they both competed coming up the North Saskatchewan into the Blackfoot territory, Blackfoot country, to get the Blackfoot trade, and how they did it. So this is actually really good reading if you wanted to take a look. If you take a look at the next image, here's another book by the late, great Hugh Dempsey. And he writes about Firewater and its effect, basically liquor on the Blackfoot tribes. But he speaks, this is mostly about Fort Benton and how the trade kind of went from there, from the American side, up into Canada with the Whoop-Up, with the establishment of Fort Whoop-Up and all the different whiskey posts, all the way as far as Red Deer River, and how that affected. And it talks a little bit more in depth about some of the things that happened during that time. So if you get a chance, this is another book that you could read. This is very good reading, has a lot of historical documentation and pictures. So if we look at the next image, this is another book that you can take a look at, and this is called Bearchild, and this is about the life and times of Jerry Potts. Now Jerry Potts actually was half Blackfoot, and his name was Gayokosi, and the Blackfoot looked at him as one of us, but he ended up becoming a scout for the Northwest Mounted Police. And so his life kind of covered the whiskey trade. And he actually became good friends with a lot of those Blackfoot chiefs that signed the treaty in 1877, such as Red Crow and Crowfoot and Medicine Chief, and a lot of these different leaders at that time. And he was involved in a lot of the big battles that happened between the Blackfoot and the Creo and the Cineboi. So if you wanted to know a little bit about the history of the United States, the American Fur Company moving up the Missouri, then this is one of the books that you can read by Jerry Potts. So actually with that, I guess this is the end of our program. Just want to say we'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves, and Gator Mutson.